Boone Carter had bought an entire ghost town for exactly $100, a bargain that would have made people laugh if there had been anything of value left. He had expected to find rows of rotting wooden houses, collapsed roofs, gaping windows, the wind howling through dusty streets marked only by coyote tracks. But as he rode past the rickety sign that read Eagle Rock, population 214, he realized something was wrong. A thin gray smoke rose from the brick chimney of the building that had once housed the town's general store. Smoke in a dead town was like gunfire in the middle of the night, a sign that someone was there and possibly trouble. The side of the store, which should have been full of weeds, was plowed, and rows of green vegetables grew like silent soldiers in the hot sun. And through the cracked window, a figure passed by as quickly as a bird disappearing into the darkness inside. Boone pulled on the reins, keeping the horse still in the swirling dust, his eyes scanning every corner. He had traveled the frontier and knew that anything unusual was cause for concern. A title deed was tucked into his coat pocket, stating that everything at Eagle Rock was his. But papers were only valid for those who believed in the law. The West lived by a different kind of law, the law of guns the land, and those who would keep what was theirs at any cost. The hinges creaked. The wooden door of the shop opened, and there she was, Dorothy Whitmore. Small in stature, but with a sharp gaze, her sunburned hands gripping the stock of a Winchester rifle. Her faded cloth cap was pulled low, hiding her silver-streaked hair and the darkness in her eyes. Each step she took up the steps was a clear statement. "This is my territory." Boone lowered one hand from the saddle, revealing his empty hand, a gesture of peace, but he did not move. "Madam," he said in a low voice, audible but not threatening, "it seems we need to talk. I have just bought this town from the county." Dorothy did not lower her gun. "You buy papers, Carter. Papers don't feed anyone through the winter." Her voice was hoarse, heavy as desert dust in her lungs. He frowned. "I don't mean to cause trouble, but if you're here, that meaning my niece and I have been living here for 3 months, after losing everything." Her eyes flashed, but not with tears, with a stubborn, hard sort of way. "The bank took our farm. My husband died. There was nowhere to go but this ruin." A gust of wind blew stirring dust up the main street, carrying a dry cough from inside the shop. It was a deep, heavy cough mixed with the ragged breathing of someone too weak to hide their illness. Boone looked toward the sound, then back at Dorothy. "She is very ill." Dorothy nodded slowly. "Zara, my niece, can't afford to go any farther. And this is the only roof over her head." Boone glanced at the small garden. The rows of beans and corn did not grow naturally in this dry soil. Each row was a sweat, each green leaf a struggle against the scorching sun and the cold night dew. "Did you grow it yourself?" he asked. Dorothy took a breath, keeping the gun at her hip. "If we hadn't grown our own, we would have starved last month. Every day here is a struggle between the earth and the sky. And I'm not giving up Carter. Not while Zara is breathing." Boone did not answer right away. He knew that look, the look of those who have been pushed to the wall by life, but still grit their teeth and stand firm. A pride that cannot be bought with gold, nor shaken with threats. In the distance, a hawk spread its wings against the silvery blue sky. In the shadow of the decaying town, two men stood face to face, one who had come to start, one who had clung on to avoid losing the last. Both understood this land was not for the weak, and survival came not just from the faster gun, but from the will to refuse to kneel. Boone gave the reins a gentle squeeze, but did not turn the horse. "I have no intention of throwing you out of here," he said, his voice firm. "But if we are to stay, we need to come to an agreement, and I need to know exactly what I am dealing with." Dorothy tilted her head slightly as if considering his words. Then she took a step back, keeping her eyes on Boone. "Then come in. But remember, this is my home, and I will protect it at all costs." The wooden door closed softly behind Boone, blocking out the light from the street. In the smell of smoke and dry earth, he knew one thing for sure: this ghost town was not dead. Not when there were still people strong enough to hold on amid the desolation. And it was that strength that Boone Carter had really bought for $100. On the frontier, it was said the dust always brought news before the messenger. That morning, the dust on the road leading to Eagle Rock rose into a yellow cloud, signaling the approach of cavalry. Boone Carter stood outside the grocer's porch, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his wide-brimmed hat. He knew trouble when he saw it, and that dust smelled like it. The first horse emerged from the dust, mounted by a willow-thin man with a hard face and cold eyes. Sheriff Marcus Crowe. Behind him were two deputies, their faces expressionless, but their hands hovering near the butts of their rifles. Boone did not move. Inside the store, Dorothy Whitmore stood by the counter, her Winchester propped against the wall but within reach. From the back room came Zara's cough, hoarse and persistent. Crow stopped his horse in the middle of the main street, a long, empty, dusty strip, and dismounted his boots, clicking loudly on the dry earth. Dorothy Whitmore, he said, his voice booming, drawing out each syllable as if he wanted the whole dead town to hear. The Millfield Bank has waited long enough. Your debt, $800 principal and interest, must be paid today. Dorothy stepped onto the porch, her shoulders square, her eyes hard as stone. I don't owe you a penny, Marcus, and you know it. Crow smiled without warmth. I know your husband's signature is on the bank records. He borrowed money for land reclamation and machinery. Too bad he died before he could pay it off. The signature is forged, said Dorothy, her voice firm. My husband never borrowed any money, and if he were alive, he would say the same thing. Crow shrugged. The dead don't talk. The law is clear. The husband's debts are the wife's debts. He glanced into the shop where Zara's cough had ended in a weak breath. And I see you're hiding someone else. You're both coming with me now. Boone stepped down from the steps and stood between Crow and Dorothy. Road dust clung to his boots and the sun cast long shadows. Sheriff, this is my land. The people on my land are my guests. No one leaves without my consent. Crow turned his gaze colder. You bought this town from the county, right? Then you also bought the debts that hung on it. Do you want to take them on? Carter Boone did not answer immediately. He looked Crow straight in the eye, his voice even and firm. I have seen no documents to prove that the debt is real. If you have any, show them. There was a moment's hesitation, then Crow smirked. I don't need to prove anything to you. My job is to enforce the law. Boone did not back down. It is not a law written by bankers. If you want to catch them, you will have to go through me. Crow's two deputies moved hands on the grips of their guns. The air was as tense as a bowstring. One false move, and Eagle Rock would hear gunfire again after years of silence. Crow studied Boone, his eyes calculating. Then he chuckled, not with amusement, but with calculation. You've made yourself a part of this, Carter, and I'll give you time to think it over. He turned to his two deputies. We're out. Then he turned his gaze back to Boone and Dorothy, his voice dropping to a deadly promise. I'm coming back tomorrow. Not just me, I'll bring a federal marshal with me, and when he comes, no one here can stop him. Boone stood still, watching Crow mount his horse. The sun had not yet set, but Crow and his horse's shadows were long and scarred on the ground. The three horses turned, sending up clouds of dust, leaving the town in a heavy silence. Dorothy stepped closer to Boone, her eyes no longer as sharp as when Crow had appeared, but instead tired and worried. You just bought yourself trouble, Carter. Boone looked back down the road Crow had taken, where dust still hung. Perhaps, he said, but some trouble is worth saving. Inside, Zara coughed again, so faint it sounded like she was about to die. Dorothy hurried in, and Boone followed, closing the wooden door behind her, blocking out the wind and dust. He knew he had entered a battle where Crow's rules would not decide the outcome. In this land, only the will and the tenacity were enough to survive. And if Crow returned with Marshal, Boone would be ready, not just for Dorothy and Zara, but for anyone who believed that justice could not be bought with $800 and a forged signature. If you love these kinds of dramatic and humane Western stories, please subscribe, like, and share so more people can hear about the bravery, resilience, and life-changing moments in the wilderness. Every support you give helps us continue to bring powerful and heartwarming stories to audiences everywhere. The Eagle Rock afternoon passed in an unnatural silence. The sky was so high and clear that the outlines of the distant mountains were as clear as if cut with a knife. Boone Carter was standing in front of the grocery store, listening for every sound when a new cloud of dust appeared to the east. It wasn't just one person, it was a whole group. A dozen horsemen rode forward, the dust swirling in golden clouds behind them. Leading the way was a middle-aged woman, her hair tied in a bun, her face tanned, but her eyes shining like forged steel. Ruth Henley. Boone had never met her, but he had heard the name in stories that spread across the border, the woman who refused to bow to injustice. She stopped her horse in the middle of the street, and her companions scattered their eyes, scanning the town warily. Dorothy Whitmore, Ruth called, her voice loud but firm. Dorothy stepped onto the porch, the Winchester in her hand, but the barrel pointing down. Ruth said, Dorothy both surprised and alarmed. "What are you doing here?" "Same thing you're doing, just trying to survive," Ruth replied. She gestured to the group of residents behind her, 15 families, all of whom lost their land to Crow and the Millfield Bank. Our husbands were forced to sign loans they'd never seen before. Boone listened and saw the pieces of the puzzle begin to fit together. This was not just Dorothy's story. This was a system, a trap set to crush the defenseless. Ruth bent down and took a folded piece of paper from the saddle. "We have a chance." Samuel Chen, the bank clerk, sent the message. He forged the signature, but now wants to tell everything. "Willing to go to court as long as we protect him." Dorothy glanced at Boone. He nodded slightly, but before she could speak, Zara coughed from inside, different from her usual cough. Deep choking, and then a bright red smear of blood on the cloth. Dorothy rushed in, Boone close behind. Zara sat huddled on a bed made of crates and torn blankets, her face pale, her lips blue. Blood streaked her handkerchief. "Oh my God," Boone muttered. Dorothy pressed her calloused hand to the child's forehead. "It was hot." "He grows weaker by the hour," she said softly, but her eyes remained unyielding, as if fear were something she did not have the luxury of. A new sound of hooves interrupted the moment, fast and single. Boone glanced out the window and saw a familiar figure, Sheriff Marcus Crow, alone, riding forward with the speed of someone running from something. He almost jumped off his horse in front of the shop, breathing heavily. Gone was the calm of a ruler, replaced by restlessness, his eyes wavering. "Marshall is dead," Crow said without beating around the bush. "Samuel Chen is gone." And he paused, as if swallowing what he was about to say. "I'm just a pawn in this game." No one answered immediately. Boone folded his arms, waiting for him to continue. "Millfield Bank doesn't just do business with me. There are bigger, richer people sitting in the territorial capital controlling everything. I thought I was enforcing the law. Turns out I was protecting their money." Crow chuckled bitterly. "They'd kill Marshall, kill Chen, and if necessary, kill all of us to keep this quiet." Dorothy stepped forward, the distance between her and Crow being only a few steps. "If you're telling the truth, why did you come back here?" Crow looked at her for a long moment, then turned his gaze to the room where Zara lay. "Because I saw a child coughing up blood and a grandmother standing in front of her house with a gun pointed at her. And I realized that was something I had never done for anyone. I was tired of keeping my head down." Outside, Ruth and the group of residents stood in a circle, listening to every word. A wind blew through the main street, carrying dust and a chill that signaled the approach of night. Boone looked at Crow, then at Dorothy. It was clear this was no longer about a few forged papers, but a fight against a machine that would crush them if they did not stand together. And Zara, the girl gasping in the dark room, was the reason they could not give up. "If Chen is alive, we must find him before they do," he said, his voice as deep and steady as a rock. "If he is dead, we must still bring the truth to light. And first, we must keep Zara alive through the night." In the fading light, the faces around Boone, Dorothy, Crow, and Ruth all wore the same look, tired but unbroken. Though darkness and danger lay ahead, the same thing burned in their eyes, the will to survive of people who had lost too much to fear. The evening wind blew down Eagle Rock's main street, carrying the smell of dust and gunpowder from the morning's confrontation. Boone Carter stood in front of the general store, looking at Marcus Crow, the man he had once been willing to shoot against, now standing with the tired look of a warhorse that had run too long. Crow looked away from the horizon, his voice hoarse and deep. "There is an Indian medicine man up north. He has saved people the white doctors have failed to save. If you want to save Zara, I know the quickest way." Dorothy paused. There was still doubt in her eyes, but behind them was Zara's wheezing, a faint rhythm, like a candle in the wind. "Why now?" she asked. Crow looked straight at her. "Because I'm tired of letting children die just because I follow someone else's orders." And he swallowed. "Because I have a granddaughter too. I don't want to watch another child die." Before anyone could reply, the sound of hooves was heard at the end of the street. A line of cavalrymen in long cloaks, guns slung at their sides, advanced Millfield Bank troops. They advanced in tight formation, the cold eyes of men accustomed to using violence to collect debts. But this time they didn't find a deserted town. They found a long line of people blocking the street. Ruth Henley and 15 families of the victims flanked by 3 journalists with cameras and notebooks and a thin man in a gray coat, the territory surveyor. The click of cameras mingled with the neighing of horses. A reporter shouted, "What are you doing in front of the cameras of the whole region?" The bank guards froze, realizing that every move would now be recorded and broadcast throughout the towns. The investigator stepped forward, his voice clear. "Millfield Bank is under investigation for forgery and land grabbing. And before you ask, yes, we have evidence." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick file. "Samuel Chen has turned over everything: books, forged signatures, even letters between the board and officials." Dorothy raised her head. "Chen is alive," the investigator nodded. "Wounded but alive. And not just alive, he saved Federal Marshal Davidson's life. Marshall will testify, and I guarantee this will bring down Millfield Bank." Crow stood still, as if each word was undoing an invisible chain around him. "So all I do is serve them," he said quietly, almost to himself. Boone put his hand on Crow's shoulder. "What matters is what you choose to do next." Crow took a deep breath, then turned to Dorothy. "Let's go. If we leave now, I can get Zara to the medicine hut before nightfall." They prepared in silence. Ruth and a few men helped tie a makeshift travois out of stakes and blankets and laid Zara on it. She whimpered softly, but her eyes remained closed. Boone tightened the ropes. Crow checked the saddle. Outside, the bank guard stood stock still, held back by the camera lenses and the cold gazes of the people who had lost everything but remained upright. The journalists continued to take notes. The investigators packed their files into briefcases. Not a single shot was fired, at least not yet. As Boone, Dorothy, and Crow left town, the afternoon sun streaked the sand in golden streaks. Each step that took them away from Eagle Rock was a precious heartbeat for Zara. Boone could tell that this was not just a rescue mission, but Crow's first ride toward justice. Back in town, Ruth had walked up the steps and watched. She knew the legal battle would be long, but today they had won something more important: the belief that even in this harsh land, people could change course when they found their sense of purpose. And on the road to Indian country, Crow spurred his horse faster, the wind whipping his face, his eyes no longer averted. Regardless of his past sins, he was running with the same goal: to bring the child back to full breath. Zara breathed like a trapped bird. Each breath came in short, weak gasps that seemed to be about to die. Boone Carter placed a calloused hand on her chest, feeling the rapid, alarmingly weak beat of her heart. The small room smelled of kitchen smoke and old herbal medicine, and Dorothy knelt beside her, her hands clasping Zara's as if she could hold her down with her own strength. Marcus Crow stood in the doorway, his eyes dark. "If we don't leave now, she won't make it through the night," he said, his voice as hard as a rifle butt. "I know a shortcut, 30 miles of rough terrain, but we should be at the native medicine hut by sundown." Dorothy looked up, her eyes blazing with fear. 30 miles in this condition, there was no other choice. Boone replied, his voice hoarse and firm. "Go." They worked like people who knew every second counted. Ruth Henley and a few men made a travois out of wooden stakes and blankets. Boone carefully placed Zara on it, trying not to hurt her. Crow checked the saddle, tightened the reins. Dorothy covered Zara with another blanket, leaned down and whispered in Zara's ear, "You'll see the light of day, will you?" As they left Eagle Rock, they left behind a main street full of people standing still watching them. The midday sun was scorching and sand was kicked up by the galloping hooves. Crow led the way, taking the north route, a route known only to those who had lived their entire lives in this region. The first stage was a dry, cracked plain, the wind cutting like a knife. Boone could see sweat beading on Crow's temple, but his pace did not falter. Every time the horse crossed a berm, he glanced down at Travois, where Zara lay still, her pale skin a stark contrast to the dark blanket. They reached the narrow gorge as the sun was setting in the west. The path was barely wide enough for one horse, with sheer cliffs on either side. The sound of hooves echoed through the gorge like a drum beat. Dorothy held on tight, her eyes never leaving her granddaughter. "She's breathing," she whispered, as if to reassure herself. Out of the ravine, the terrain became steep and rugged. They had to dismount and lead their horses over slippery rocks where one false step would send them both tumbling down the cliff. Crow went first, feeling the way step by step, his hand occasionally touching the rock wall, looking for a handhold. Boone was in the middle, holding the rope, Dorothy following behind to keep watch. Once the travois caught in a crevice in the rocks. Boone and Crow bent down and lifted it, while Dorothy shielded Zara from the dust and rubble. Quick Crow urged, "We're losing the light." As dusk began to tint the mountains, Crow led them onto a trail that skirted the hillside. Below them, the valley opened up like a map, and in the distance, wisps of smoke rose from the pines, a sign of life. "About 2 miles," Crow said, panting. "With any luck, we'll make it before dark." But fortune in the west is often a fragile promise. A sudden bend brought them to a rapid stream, the water rising above their horses' knees. Crow galloped ahead, Boone behind the horse, shaking so violently that Dorothy almost fell. She clung and prayed, her eyes never leaving Zara's face. At last they climbed the other side. Darkness had begun to swallow the trail, the only light being the crescent moon. Crow gave a final spur, and through the pines came the wooden medicine man's cabin, the fire flickering through the crack in the door. An old man with long silver hair stepped out, his black eyes as deep as an ancient well. He didn't ask any questions, just gestured for the girl to come in. Inside, the smell of herbs was strong and warm. He placed his hand on Zara's forehead and nodded slightly. "There's still time." Dorothy let out the breath she had been holding all this way. Boone sat down on the wooden chair, sweating, his hands still shaking with tension. Crow stood in the corner, watching silently, his eyes devoid of coldness. For the first time in years, only relief and a faint glimmer of hope. Outside, night had fallen over the mountains, but inside the small hut, the light and warmth of the fire began to chase away the darkness. They had saved Zara from death for tonight at least. And in the West, sometimes just one more night of fighting was a victory. If you want to hear more dramatic and humane Western stories like this, please subscribe, like, and share so we can continue to bring you life and death journeys, battles for justice, and moments of resilience in the face of adversity. Each of your support is a step further in our storytelling journey. The 3 days in the native village were longer than any journey Boone Carter had ever undertaken. In the small wooden hut, the doctor and Dorothy took turns tending to Zara, spoonfuls of herbal medicine, cool cloths pressed to her forehead. Boone lost count of the number of times he sat outside watching the dew on the grass, listening for the hoot of an owl, waiting for a sound that would signal that she was still breathing. On the third morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, Zara opened her eyes. "Water," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. Dorothy burst into tears, hugging her granddaughter tightly. Boone stepped outside, took a deep breath, and for the first time in days, he felt his chest fill with air. 6 months later, Eagle Rock was no longer the name people used. A new sign at the top of the street read New Haven in white letters, set against a new wood panel. The once dusty, abandoned street now echoed with the sounds of hammering children's laughter and early store openings. Boone Carter did the unthinkable. He divided the entire plot of land he had bought for $100 among the families who had been robbed by the Millfield Bank. He kept a small corner on the edge of town where he built a modest farm with cows and a sunny garden. "Enough for one person to live on," he said, "the rest for those who need it more." Dorothy Whitmore now runs the new grocery store, which once served as a makeshift shelter from the rain and wind. The shelves are stocked with rice flour, salt, sugar, and even small items the townspeople never thought they would see again, like freshly ground coffee or candy for the kids. Zara, strong and agile, often runs around the counter, helping her stock the shelves or carrying items to customers. Marcus Crow, having served time in the penitentiary for his old crimes, returned with a new badge and a new promise to protect the people, not the strong. He was no longer the cold shadow of power who rode down the streets to strike fear. Now he patrolled the town with a few young men, stopping to chat with children, checking the fences of the old people's stables. The Millfield Bank ceased to exist. After the truth about the forged documents and land grabs was exposed, the bank's assets were seized and redistributed to the families who had lost everything. The territorial newspaper called the incident Justice Day, and New Haven was proof that even in the harsh West, justice could prevail. One autumn afternoon, Boone stood in the garden watching the leaves turn red and yellow. From there, he could see Zara chasing chickens behind the shop, her laughter ringing in the clear air. Dorothy set up her stall on the porch, waving to him when she caught his eye. Crow passed by, raised his hand in greeting, and continued his patrol. Boone knew that if anyone asked him what the most precious thing he had ever bought, would not be about cows or fertile land. He would talk about a town that had died and was now alive, about a little girl who had been on the brink of death and now ran around in the sun, and about people who had stood against adversity to find each other. He came to Eagle Rock in search of a cheap business opportunity. He left New Haven each day with a new family, a new community, and the belief that sometimes the most valuable things are not bought with money but with the courage to stand up for what is right. If you love this story and want to hear more stories of the West that are dramatic, humane, and filled with resilience, please subscribe to the channel, like, and share. Each of your support is a brick that builds new journeys where justice is served and hope is found in the harsh desert.